All right, hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker, and today is a special, not planned for episode. So I was just so you guys know on the Pro Shroud side, just did a show yesterday on the Great Lakes Studios podcast with Jordan Hatfield and Teddy Pappas, doing a 4.5 hour plus podcast on the evidence for the Shroud of Turin. So there was a lot of great content in there, but it wasn't done as a live stream. It was done as a recording. So Jordan's going to be editing that and posting that up whenever he gets a chance. Obviously, once he posts that up on his channel, I will transfer it to my own Real Seekers podcast. But that said, I don't have a show lined up for today then because I was expecting to post up Jordan's show on the Shroud of Turin. So since I'm not doing that, I want to look at the historical evidence for the resurrection. We're just 1 week after Easter here, and basically, I have a fan request. So my friends Dr. Gary Habermas and pro shroud expert Joe Marino reached out to me about a skeptical article written by a skeptic named Jeff Davis. And this skeptic has written a thing called a quick little popular level paper called 14 Reasons Why Christians Doubt the Easter Story. So I want to give my quick, this will be a brief show, hopefully. I want to give my quick take on these supposed 14 reasons that Christians are skeptics about about the bodily resurrection of Jesus. Let's see what this guy has to say. So let me share my screen here for you peeps. Sharing audio. Okay. Up. There you are. Okay, so let us get into this. Okay, so full screen. Perfect. So 14 reasons some Christians don't believe the Easter story, addressing an online resurrection skeptic named Jeff Davis. So, firstly, this guy says, number one, the gospel resurrection accounts are inconsistent and contradictory. According to this skeptic, he says, if you read the four gospels side by side, you'll notice some pretty glaring inconsistencies in the resurrection story. How many women went to the tomb? What did they see when they got there? Who did Jesus appear to first? These details vary depending on which gospel you read, as Bart Ehrman likes to say in his debates. Well, what are my responses to this first reason for doubt, according to this skeptic, that Christians doubt the resurrection tale? So in the first place, the first response here is the one that my friend Dr. Gary Habermas gives, and it's basically to take a minimal facts approach, to say, well, look, even if there are contradictions, that's totally irrelevant. It doesn't speak to the truth of the historical hypothesis that Jesus rose from the dead historically. Contradictions could be true, and it could still be true, the hypothesis that Jesus rose from the dead as a historical event. Those true things could be true. So it's irrelevant. Even the hypothesis, making it a bit more theological, saying God raised Jesus from the dead, that could be true, and there could be contradictions in the secondary details of the resurrection story. That's totally irrelevant. Now, where I think these contradictions do become relevant, if there are such in the Gospels in terms of the resurrection accounts, is not so much in terms of the resurrection hypothesis proper, but in terms of the hypothesis that Christianity is true. Because obviously I've argued that the Bible is sufficient, including the Gospels, are sufficiently attached to the truth of Christianity. They are divinely inspired literature. And so if there are such contradictions in these secondary details, then that might be an issue in terms of falsifying Christianity. So that's what I would say there, is that in terms of the resurrection proper, resurrection contradictions have nothing to do with it. In fact, historians prove that contradictions are helpful in proving a secular historical case for historical events, because we have no collusion or conspiracy, and it shows they are multiple independent events, all attesting to Jesus' resurrection, even if they get minor secondary details wrong, like how many women were at the tomb. Doesn't matter. It's a concrete fact that every source independently agrees there was an empty tomb. You can't deny that. Now, a second approach is the literal harmonization approach by Dr. Lydia McGrew and others, right? And they say, Look, there are no contradictions. You're just wrong, skeptic. Christians who think there are contradictions are wrong. They're foolish. They've made a mistake, an error in judgment. And we can take the Gospels literally, and the accounts are fully reconcilable. And Lydia McGrew does this. Tecton TV, he's got a great paper that I've linked to there, where he says, look, that there's nothing that's contradictory here, because yes, the Gospels report different women at the tomb, but it doesn't say only these women were present. So it's not technically excluding the other women that are mentioned in the other Gospels. So it could have been they were there as a group. That's fully plausible. Some Gospels highlighted certain women, other Gospels highlighted other women, but all those women were there, present at the same time. There's no provable contradiction here at all, and this is perfectly historically plausible, as J.P. Holding argues on his Tectonics article on the website there that you see right here. And I'll include these links in my slides on my blog for people on this video. Finally, we have Dr. Mike Lacona's approach. Again, they say, look, there are no contradictions here, you foolish skeptic, resurrection skeptic, because we don't take these things literally. Really, the gospel writers are using ancient literary devices. And in this case, Mike Lacona argues in terms of the women and that sort of thing. He says, well, look, he's just using this well-known ancient literary device that Plutarch and other ancient Greco-Roman biographies and historians use, such as spotlighting. So I want to play a quick little 7-minute video from Inspiring Philosophy talking about Mike's argument here. So let me bring that up for you guys. All right. Okay, so here it is from Inspiring Philosophy, giving the ancient literary device approach.
Fiction. How many women went to the tomb? One of the most popular alleged contradictions is to point out each gospel says a different number of women went to the tomb on Sunday morning. Matthew says Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. Mark says Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. Luke says it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and additional women. And John only mentions Mary Magdalene. So all agree Mary Magdalene was there, but Matthew adds another Mary. Mark and Luke say this was Mary the mother of James, and Mark adds someone else named Salome, and Luke adds Joanna. So skeptics assert the Gospels are inconsistent and cannot give us a clear picture of who was at the tomb on Sunday morning. However, in reality, skeptics are overplaying their hand. The issue can be sorted out by noting the ancient literary practice of spotlighting. First, it should be obvious, no gospel says only the women I have listed went to the tomb. Since they do not say this, the gospels do not necessarily contradict. Second, take the Gospel of John. It is true he says Mary went to the tomb, but in the very next verse, he reports that Mary said, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." It is unlikely she is referring to herself as a royal plural, and more likely implies there were other women with her. So in reality, both John and Luke are open to there being additional women with Mary. The reason as to why John doesn't mention them has to do with the ancient literary practice called spotlighting. The scholar Mike Lacona defines spotlighting as when an author focuses attention on a person so that the person's involvement in a scene is clearly described, whereas mention of others who were likewise involved is neglected. The author has shined his literary spotlight on that person. Think of a theatrical performance. During an act in which several are simultaneously on the stage, the lights go out and a spotlight shines on a particular actor. Others are present but are unseen. In literary spotlighting, the author only mentions one of the people present, but knows of the others. Lacona highlights how spotlighting occurs in other ancient works. Specifically, he goes through the lives of Plutarch and compares how Plutarch alone writes each separate biography. Given that Plutarch...
Yeah, so I think that's enough. You get the point that, yeah, look, this is explained by spotlighting. Different gospel writers are spotlighting different women in terms of their terms of what they're reporting on. Okay, so that's my answer to the first objection here. What's the second reason Christians don't believe in the Easter stories? Well, supposedly the earliest gospel, Mark, doesn't mention the resurrection. Well, unfortunately for this resurrection skeptic, he's just simply wrong. I mean, in the first place, in terms of the ending of Mark, verses 9 to 20, or whatever it is, this probably was a part of the original. Many commentaries contain mistakes and inaccuracies about Mark 16, verses 9 to 20, and it would require a lot to go into those details. But influential biblical scholar Dr. N.T. Wright responds, look, two of the earliest manuscripts contain anomalous features that indicate that their copyists were well aware of prior copies that included verses 9 to 20 as part of the original. This explicitly speaks of the resurrection. Now, even if you don't buy this longer ending of the Gospel of Mark as being a part of the original, it's what we do have in the Gospel of Mark implies that there was a resurrection. It says explicitly in verse 6, Jesus was risen from the dead, and tells them to go tell the disciples because Jesus will appear to them. So it implies that the resurrection appearances happened in verse 6. So this is just total nonsense. There's no reason to doubt this. You are a hyper radical, irrational skeptic if you think this is a good objection to the resurrection. Thirdly, the idea of the bodily resurrection was not a Jewish belief. What rubbish. The idea of a bodily resurrection was uniquely and exclusively a Jewish belief during the time of Jesus. This has been absolutely proven, 100% zero doubt, by Dr. N.T. Wright in his 700-page meticulous scholarly work on his book on the resurrection of the Son of God, where he looks at every single source mentioning resurrection from pagan, Jewish, and Christian sources from 200 BC to 200 AD. So that's 200 years on either side of the historical Jesus Christ. And every one of them, without exception, mentions bodily resurrection. And when it came to Jews, the Jews believed in a bodily resurrection. You simply have to learn your facts before you speak here, skeptic. Number 4, the empty tomb doesn't necessarily prove a resurrection. Well, guess what? He says, look, just because Jesus' tomb was found empty, that doesn't necessarily mean that he was resurrected. There could be other explanations like grave robbers or Jesus followers moving the body, or some other such, like a necromancer, or someone who heard an unknown disciple who heard Jesus' prophecies and predictions about his resurrection in 3 days. There are other options. And guess what? On this front, I agree. No Christian has ever claimed the empty tomb alone is the only evidence that sufficiently proves that Jesus rose from the dead. No, instead, we argue the empty tomb is a necessary, not a sufficient condition. And it's a necessary evidential component for proving the resurrection of Christ. So, yeah, no one has made this argument. So you're correct here. But this isn't a problem for Christians. If there are Christians who doubt simply because the empty tomb alone doesn't prove a bodily resurrection in itself, then they're simply ignorant. They have not seen proper arguments for the resurrection of Jesus. 5, the post-resurrection appearances could have been hallucinations. Oh my goodness, some skeptical Christians argue that the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus could have been hallucinations or visions experienced by his grieving followers. Response to this: look, Christians don't believe the resurrection appearances were natural hallucinations. So show me a Christian who believes that, and I'll show you an atheist or a skeptic. He's not someone who really is a true Bible-believing Christian. And look, there's a difference between subjective natural hallucinations, which is there's no reality correspondent in reality that's causing this type thing, right? Where the hallucinations is purely subjective and psychological in nature. Whereas visions, that's something like what Christian Dale Allison believes in. He believes in an objective vision of a spiritual, non-bodily Jesus and resurrection appearance. So for him, it's akin to a post-death communication of ghosts after people die. That's what the resurrection appearances were. But that's an objective vision there is an external referent. Jesus really was there. His spiritual ghost was there, and they were seeing that objectively. That's not the same as a hallucination. So this guy confuses and conflates different types of phenomena here. Natural hallucinations are not the same as supernatural objective visions of a spiritual Jesus. But yes, in terms of the former, there's no Christian, there's no true Christian who believes that. In terms of this vision account, Dale Allison is an example. I think he's a true Christian. He's definitely wrong and unbiblical in his opinion that Jesus rose from the dead spiritually rather than physically and bodily. But I'm not totally sure that I would rule out Dale Allison as a Christian. I just think he's honestly mistaken on that front. Again, it all depends on, is belief in a physical or bodily resurrection as opposed to just a Jesus resurrection in general essential for salvation? Can people be included in salvation even if they get that detail wrong about the mode of Jesus' resurrection? But yeah, so this is not only that. Look, in terms of could they be hallucinations, it is psychologically impossible. You just have to learn the medical facts here, skeptic. You can do this coulda, woulda, shoulda game all you want, but to appeal to mere possibilities, maybe there's a 1 out of 10 billion chance that it was a hallucination. Maybe, who knows? Yeah. Well, all medical experts specializing in hallucinations, and I've consulted them a couple of them personally, based on Mike Lacona mentioning them in his book, they have proven absolutely conclusively there is not a PhD or an MD medical doctor or expert who would say, yeah, look, simultaneous, multimodal, because a group hallucinations where a group of the 12 or 500 all simultaneously had hallucinations that were multimodal, including touch, hearing, sight. This is just physically impossible to occur. And there are many other reasons to rule out subjective natural hallucinations as an explanation as well, such as my argument based on Jake O'Connell's argument that they saw him as a mundane bodily resurrection of Jesus. That was inconsistent with their ingrained social expectations of a glorious resurrection body, something like, Jesus's transfiguration. That's how they would have seen Jesus if this was just a subjective hallucination, because it would have to be consistent with their prior expectations that was ingrained into their heads as to what resurrection entailed. Now, I just want to play a little 5-minute clip here, a 6-minute clip of medical expert Dr. Joseph Bergeron speaking on this issue of hallucinations and how ridiculous it is in trying to explain the post-resurrection appearances. So let me bring that up. All right. Stop sharing. Whoops. Present. Share sound. All right. 109. Sorry. 1956.
Problems with that. So you don't have a whole lot of options left. Well, you could propose, psychiatric phenomena. They were hallucinating. Well, if you're going to say that, if you're going to offer a medical explanation for what the disciples were experiencing, you need to provide a medical opinion and substantiation about how that would occur. Because a hallucination is a symptom, it's not really a diagnosis. You just don't say they were hallucinating and shrug and walk away and think you've done well, because you haven't. And so hallucinations occur primarily by 3 underlying mechanisms: psychophysiological, which could occur from perhaps certain types of strokes or tumors or things that could cause hallucinations. Psychodynamic would be psychiatric disease and an intrusion into the conscious mind, which is people with severe mental illness can hallucinate, or psychobiochemical, where you have derangement of the brain chemistry, where people go into a state of delirium. And so you see that with alcoholic withdrawal, what's called the DTs. But I have seen people in all those conditions, and it's a very ugly thing to witness. I was talking to a physician one time, and he said, we see things that humans shouldn't have to see. And that's true. I mean, I think probably most of us in the medical work carry a certain level of PTSD. I've seen things that I don't like to think about. And to see someone in a chemical delirium is really ugly. I mean, they see snakes crawling in the bed. They see elephants walking in the room. It's scary. They're not having lunch with their beloved savior. And so when I collected all that literature and read through all of it, and just understood that they had no idea what they were talking about. And I was even reading a book by one of the main proponents, a skeptic scholar named Gerd Ludemann. And I threw the book on the floor and I said, "You believe that?" I was talking to the book. Forgive me. I don't know. I had my own psychiatric moment. When I was talking to the book, I said, "How can you believe that?" It's just clear that they had no idea what they were talking about. And so, were all the disciples suffering severe physical, psychiatric, or mental illness to the state that they were all hallucinating at the same time? Well, that's really not supportable. We're dealing with a group of people that Jesus hand-selected, trained, and who deployed the rapid expansion of Christianity in the first century that I read Tacitus. By the time of AD 64, when Nero launched his first mass persecution of Christians, they were all over the place. So there was a rapid expansion of Christianity in the first century. So these people were really capable and dedicated. The other thing is that we talk about group appearances with Jesus. You mentioned, or Dan mentioned, when Jesus appears to the disciples and Thomas. So, they're all seeing Jesus. There's a dozen of them or 11 of them, and they see Jesus. And in 1 Corinthians 15, the first creed of the church, Jesus appeared to 500 people at once. And when they recited the creed in those days, they would say, and most of them are still living. So you can go talk to them. Well, we can't say that creed today, but we can understand the historical significance of it. And we read the work from Tacitus. Those people, even people that didn't see him, it was so real to them, their faith in Christ, that they would die. They would accept being burned on the stake or crucified or whatever manner of torture, rather than to say it didn't happen. So the group experiences with Jesus there is no psychiatric explanation for that. So that's just outside the bounds of any kind of psychiatric phenomena. Now, there are times where groups of people can experience what you would call hallucinatory sorts of phenomena. But those kind of things are rare, and they occur in a sense where there is a group sense of excitement and expectation. And they're never identical from person to person, because they couldn't be, because any kind of hallucinatory occurrence is only and exclusively in the milieu of the person's brain. Again, when we're talking about hallucination, I should give a definition. It's an experience that is considered real by the conscious mind, for which there is no external stimulus of any of the five senses. So the hallucination, is real, but there's no physical basis for it. It's in the milieu of the person's brain. So in groups of people that experience that, it's never the same from individual to individual. With the disciples, that group dynamic was not present. they were in hiding and the door was locked, and Jesus walked through the wall. They thought they were next, right? So they were forlorn, they were in hiding. They did not go to the grave on Easter Sunday morning. The women went there to complete the embalming process, but nobody else went. There was no Easter sunrise service that day.
Okay, so I think you get the point. This is Dr. Joseph Bergeron, a medical expert, clinical psychologist who has firsthand experience working with people who have hallucinations and that sort of thing. So he knows the medical peer-reviewed literature. It is just ridiculous and physically virtually impossible that hallucinations could describe the post-resurrection appearances. I'm sorry, skeptic, you failed. So let's get back to the slides here. Okay, next objection. The resurrection story could have been a later addition. Look, this is a joke, right? I'm becoming very skeptical here. Jeff Davis here is surely he must be consulting non-Christian people, whack jobs like Jesus mythicists or radical unbelieving conspiracy nutters here. This can't be 14 reasons Christians deny the resurrection or doubt the resurrection. I don't believe this. He is clearly consulting Jesus mythicists or conspiracy theorists who don't believe. They're not real Christians. I can't believe that. There's no way that he's talking to someone who actually identifies as a Christian here. But anyways, in terms of this claim, it is total provable nonsense. Virtually everyone with a PhD in the SBL, the Society for Biblical Literature, 5,000 some odd or plus scholars, atheists, agnostics, Christians, Jewish, whatever. This is not some evangelical Christian society. This is the scholarly society of biblical scholars of all worldviews. They know that Jesus' resurrection was absolutely essential and central to the formation of the gospel message. Look, even atheists and agnostics like Dr. Bart Ehrman, someone who denies obvious truths like the empty tomb, even he's not that so radically skeptical and stupid, quite frankly, as to deny the fact that Jesus' resurrection was the foundational message of the gospel in the early church. No, this is what we know conclusively. They claim the bodily resurrection right from the beginning. And as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:14, and if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless. Throw it in the garbage. Your faith is worthless trash. That is proof. That is a falsification. It's because Jesus' bodily resurrection, absolutely essential and central message of the gospel itself from the very beginning. Undeniable, historically speaking. 7, the resurrection story borrows from pagan myths. Oh, okay. Oh my gosh. You are talking to godless Jesus mythicists. You are not talking to Christians. You're lying, Jeff. I don't believe you that you consulted Christians in coming up with this list. No Christian can be this foolish to go for Jesus mythicism. It is just baffling. But look, Jeff, I suggest you read a book. It's time to get educated in the historical scholarship because no credible Christian or scholar with a PhD believes this. There are exactly 0 provable examples of a pagan dying and rising God prior to or during the time of Jesus. If you don't believe me, let me quote a non-Christian agnostic and biblical scholar that we mentioned earlier, Dr. Bart Ehrman, who says this very thing. Okay, so let me bring up that quote. All right, so here it is. Until the 2-minute mark.
About dying and rising gods, there's this idea that there were Mesopotamian deities and other gods at the time. There was this idea that with the seasons they would die and then rise again, and that potentially Jesus was just kind of a copy pasting or a Jewish version of this notion, this idea of dying and rising deities.
Yeah, that's another one that's really overplayed. If you actually read these stories, first of all, you never have a human being who dies and comes back to life. Jesus in the Gospels is portrayed as a human being who comes back to life. He's raised from the dead, and that's not Dionysus. The gods who die, they're not gods who come back to earth. For some reason, I don't know why, but every time I talk about this, just mythicists don't believe me. But I mean, I think the best book that deals with this is one of the great historians of religion of the 20th century, who's not a Christian, but he was a historian of Christianity as one of his many, many things, Jonathan Z. Smith. Jonathan Z. Smith looks at all this material and dying and rising gods, and he shows that either they never die, or if they die, they don't rise. And so if somebody really is interested, they should look at what Smith says and go into it. There may be some instances in ancient Near East and some kind of bizarre instances many hundreds of years before Jesus of a God who dies and comes back. It's not a prominent theme in Greek and Roman religion. I don't know of a definitive case in Greek and Roman religion, let alone one before Jesus that he's modeled on. Because what happens to Jesus is not at all what happens with the dying and rising. He's not a fertility God.
So there's that clip. This is non-religious, non-Christian, agnostic Dr. Bart Ehrman, famous biblical scholar there, admitting this is just rubbish in terms of this Jesus mythicist type claim of pagan dying and rising gods. Utter horse trash. It's not real at all. And this is Dr. Bart Ehrman confirming that much. All right, so let me go back to the slides. All right. And I also included a more detailed 20-minute video in my slides for you from Inspiring Philosophy, going into a little bit more specifics on that front. Okay, 8. So the Apostle Paul never met the physical Jesus. Okay, my response to this, yes, he did. Look, you're taking the later story of Acts, written by the gospel writer Luke, who earlier in your first couple of objections, you said you rejected these gospel writers as just making stuff up later on. So now all of a sudden, when it's convenient for you as a skeptic, you're believing what Acts says, a later source, over and against what Paul claims for himself in his own writings, which date earlier by at least a few decades there. So that's a little bit of a hypocrisy on your part as a skeptic, I would say. But look, Paul is absolutely clear. He saw a risen Jesus appearance, Jesus in the bodily flesh, as the resurrected Christ, in the same way that all the other apostles did. This was a qualification in the early church. All historians agree, and biblical scholars agree. You had to see the resurrected Jesus. You couldn't just have a vision or something like that and be qualified as an apostle. So in this sense, my first response is, who cares about Acts? You know, you yourself said you don't respect the later Gospels or Acts of the Apostles as sources. So why not take what Paul's earlier sources, those letters, tell you? And on that front, it's unambiguous. He saw the risen physical Jesus. Next, in terms of throwing away Acts, you are simply wrong and mistaken. Look, I've dealt with scholars of Acts, such as Dr. Craig Keener, who is probably the best in the entire world. He's written a 4-volume, massive, 10,000-page commentary on the book of Acts. And he goes beyond any other scholar in the world in terms of proving that Acts does not deny that Paul saw the bodily risen Jesus in the flesh. Look, he did not have a vision on his Damascus Road experience. Now, admittedly, Acts does include certain theophany-like elements as secondary details, the bright light, you know, the people falling down and stuff like that. So he includes theophany-like elements, but nothing here disproves the claim that Paul actually saw the bodily Christ in the flesh. This was not a vision. Luke and Paul agree. Paul saw the risen Jesus in the flesh during his Damascus Road experience. And again, the vast majority of biblical scholars, including the top expert in the world, Dr. Craig Keener, agree on this front. So you're simply wrong on number 8. Next up, number 9. The gospel writers had an agenda. Okay, so my response here, who cares? Look, anyone who has ever written or said anything in the history of mankind has had an agenda or a teleos, a goal, a purpose for why they're writing. This is just totally irrelevant. That doesn't mean, well, because they had an agenda, therefore what they said was false, or that we're rational and just mindlessly disbelieving what they say. That's just absolutely ludicrous, because then we wouldn't know anything. We'd have to just dismiss everything. Are you dismissing science because you're relying on the testimony of scientists? Those scientists have agendas. I don't believe in the Big Bang. I don't believe that, the sky is blue because of the scattering of particles. That's just a bunch of BS by biased people with an agenda who told me that. You can see it's obviously irrational what you're doing here as a skeptic. And if supposedly these skeptical Christians are doing the same, I would say the same to them. In fact, look, it's because of the fact we can prove the gospel writers had certain biases, had certain emphases that they wanted to stress. For example, Luke, we know the Gentile church was especially important for him, and he structures his gospel to emphasize the importance of getting the gospel message out beyond Jerusalem and the Jews and to the Gentiles and stuff. But because we can detect this is what helps historians actually establish objective historical facts from these sources, especially when the facts they're reporting they contradict the agenda or emphasis or biases of the author. And we have this in abundance in the Gospels, things like the criterion of embarrassment. That's how we know the empty tomb is real, because their biases would say, we don't want to report women as the first witnesses. What the heck does a woman know? We can't trust their testimony. Well, that's a proof. It's called the criterion of embarrassment that secular historians use to say, well, that's why we know this is true. They're reporting this as a fact despite their biases because they're interested in telling the truth as to what happened. So if anything, the fact that they had an agenda helps prove what they said was true in certain specific cases. And obviously, historians applying to the Gospels have other criteria of authenticity. They have other various tools, to prove that the Gospels have been proven to be very reliable Greco-Roman biographies. And in the case of Acts, as a ancient history genre, these are extremely reliable and conservative in telling the truth as to what happened, compared to other writings within these genres, which are very flexible and loose. There's kind of a spectrum when it comes to Greco-Roman biographies and histories. There was flexibility into, like, can you make up certain details, or how accurate do you have to be to what actually happened? And on that front, the Gospels have been proven to be very conservative in that they tell the truth and nothing but the truth relative to other works of the time. So yeah, this is not a good objection. If you actually look into the scholarship, and my friend Lydia McGrew has her argument from undesigned coincidences, which I find is a very helpful thing, where something is shed light on. In one gospel, there's a mystery, but then in another gospel, you get the answer to that mystery. And these are done independently. It's not a conspiracy where they deliberately set this situation up. This is just happening naturally. So that, again, suggests the veracity of the information in the Gospels. Objection 10. The resurrection story is just too far-fetched for some people to believe. So this is kind of the typical anti-supernatural bias. And again, it's weird because Jeff Davies here is saying that it's Christians supposedly who are raising this objection. I don't know any Bible-believing true Christian who would just outright refuse to believe in miracles. I would be very skeptical of someone claiming to be a Christian who has this. It's atheists and skeptics who are go for foolish worldviews like naturalism or scientism or empiricism. So yeah, I'm just going to say, look, get over your anti-supernatural bias. There are various philosophical systems that deny the possibility of miracles. They are proven to be self-refuting and have been discredited in the scholarship by more critical and informed thinkers. There's nothing crazy about believing in God or his ability to perform supernatural acts. You're just biased. So just get over that bias and be open-minded to the truth, no matter what that truth is. 11 of 14. So the resurrection isn't essential to the Christian message. So according to Jeff Davies, some Christians argue that the physical resurrection of Jesus is not actually essential to the core message of Christianity. Well, my response, like I argued earlier in one of your earlier objections, Paul says differently. He says it is absolutely necessary and it is absolutely central and essential. And Jesus says this too. Belief in the resurrection is a specific condition for salvation versus damnation. If you believe, you'll be saved. You don't believe in Jesus' resurrection, you're damned to hell. This is explicit in the Bible. So this Christian, if a Christian is saying this, you need to read your Bible. Now, look, without Jesus' atoning death and resurrection, the theological reason behind the fact that it's essential, this belief, is that without the resurrection, we are still in our sins. We have to pay a penalty. Divine justice demands the punishment for sin, unrepented for sin, and unpunished sin is eternal damnation, eternal relational separation from God, which is what we call hell. And the Bible is clear. No amount of good works, such as, kind of like Rainbow Peter. Well, Jesus really just cares about us being loving and forgiving and engaging in social justice and good works. It's the hippie yippie gospel. No, I'm sorry, that is not the biblical gospel. That is not what Jesus taught. Good works, insufficient and irrelevant. They will not earn your way into salvation by having the right, just being, loving your neighbor and doing good works. Those things are important. Those are things and part of the gospel that Jesus teaches, right? I think that as Christians, if we are saved, our fruit will necessarily and inevitably show forth in good works. But there's a lot more to that, and that includes belief in Jesus' atoning death and resurrection. You can't ignore that component of it and just think your good works and engaging in social justice are going to get you to heaven. Read your Bible. It's not true. Number 12, the resurrection story has been used to justify violence. So Jeff Davies, the skeptic, says, unfortunately, the resurrection story has sometimes been used as a tool of violence and oppression. Some Christians have used it to justify the Crusades, Inquisitions, and other atrocities in the name of the triumphantly resurrected Christ. So what's my response? Look, number one, it's pure, unadulterated historical horse trash here from the skeptic. And I don't believe for a second that any Christian said this. This is purely an atheist objection online. Look, I've studied the history of these events, and literally zero PhD historians and scholars blame specifically belief in Jesus' atoning death and bodily resurrection for events like the Crusades or the Inquisitions. Had nothing to do with it at all. Look, there is zero logical entailment between belief in Jesus' resurrection and violence or oppression. And in fact, it's the exact opposite, provably, because Christians are motivated in large part because of how Jesus died for their sins on the cross and rose from the dead. We are motivated to follow Christ and to do those good works and to follow Jesus' commands out of a loving devotion for how he suffered on the cross for us and rose from the dead. So Jesus directly condemns such overt political acts of violence. No true follower of Christ would engage in these types of unwarranted political acts of violence like the Crusades or the Inquisitions and that sort of thing. You just utterly fail in terms of this objection. Secondly, on a historical front, look, historically, the belief in the resurrection, we know for a fact, had nothing to do with something like the Crusades. These events were mainly motivated by social and political circumstances surrounding these events and had nothing to do with theological doctrines or anything like that. If you want to argue this way, I might as well blame Islam for the Crusades, because it was their belief in Muhammad, supposedly, that started the Crusades, since it was Muslims, not Christians, who started the hostilities. Remember, totally unprovoked, Muslims were conquering innocent Christian lands, and that's why the Byzantines reached out for help. Don't believe me, skeptics? Let's listen to a secular source of historians, both Muslim and Christian, on the History Channel. There's a great documentary called The Crescent and the Cross and the Crescent. Crescent. 7:48. So I want to play that clip for you guys. All right, so let me just make sure I'm sharing my sound. But here's a clip so that you can see that with the Crusades, it had nothing to do with religious belief in Jesus' resurrection. It was purely politically motivated and socially motivated.
Pope Urban needed a master plan to put the Catholic Church back on the political map. The answer to his prayers would come in the form of a desperate plea for help from an old rival. In 1095, a desperate call for help was dispatched to the head of the Catholic Church, Pope Urban II. Sent from the imperial court of Constantinople, it came from his Eastern Christian rival, the political master of the Greek Orthodox Church, the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I. The power of Alexius's empire was slipping. The influence of his Orthodox Church had once stretched as far as the Holy Land of the Middle East. Islam was now the dominant force in the region. The Seljuk Turks were recent converts to Islam. They had emerged from the steppes of Central Asia and swept down into the Middle East in search of land. Fearsome warriors. Their armies numbered tens of thousands. They seized control of the Muslim territories of Persia, Syria, and Palestine, and finally captured the holy city of Jerusalem. Then they turned their gaze north and stormed their way to the doorstep of the great Byzantine capital, Constantinople.
The status quo, the existing power politics, the power balance of the region was changed. The Byzantines had lost a great area of taxation, of recruitment for troops. They'd lost a lot of prestige as well.
By 1095, the Emperor Alexius was desperate to strike back. But he couldn't do it alone. He appealed to the Pope, in the spirit of Christian brotherhood, to send an elite force of knights to help him keep the Turks at bay. It presented Pope Urban with a perfect opportunity to enhance his political power.
You've got to understand that the popes of that period were politicians. Much more so than they are now. Even now, the current pope intervenes in politics all the time. But at that time, the popes were big players, scheming, manipulating, intriguing, politicking. They were basically the politicians of the church.
Pope Urban was set to hijack the misfortune of the Byzantine Empire. He would launch his own holy war against Islam. A crusade that would strengthen his papacy and put Rome back at the center of the world political stage.
The idea of the crusade satisfies a number of particular agendas for the Pope. It allows him to increase his authority over the knighthood of Western Europe at the expense of other secular rulers. It directs the violent knights away from their practices of brutalizing the church in the West. It also rolls back the infidel. It begins to allow the Christians to reclaim the holy places.
All right, so that's the clip. As you can see, I didn't see anything in this secular documentary made by the History Channel talking about the belief in the resurrection of Christ as the sole cause of the Crusades, or even a cause of the Crusades. It simply did not happen that way. Okay, so next objection. Science has made it harder to believe in miracles. So this is the same as before. Look, this philosophical belief in scientism that many atheists and skeptics adopt today is self-refuting and proven false by philosophers of science who are actually using logic properly. And yeah, various philosophers of science and scientists in the know all laugh at people who think this way. It is the very height of foolishness and arrogance. Look, what is science? Science just means knowledge, right? And true knowledge. And it has become known as a specific form of knowledge in the modern world, one that employs a certain methodology, which is really helpful in gaining knowledge about our natural world and universe and how it works. In particular, it tries to establish certain laws of nature as generalized descriptions of what normally happens in our universe. Look, laws of nature are descriptive. They are not inherently prescriptive. There's nothing about a mathematical description that proves that supernatural events are impossible. Um, there is nothing about science that precludes or excludes the plausibility of miraculous or supernatural events. This is just a philosophical bias on the part of atheists and skeptics, and supposedly any Christians who are making this claim as well. You have zero warrant. You are irrational if you believe this. Okay, the last and final objection from this guy is number 14. Doubt is a normal part of the faith. Guess what? I say true. But belief and assurance are also normal parts of faith too. And in fact, as my thumbnail here says, in I think the Gospel of John 20, Jesus tells us, look, believe, don't doubt, but believe. So doubt may be a normal part of faith, but it's inevitable because we live in a fallen, sinful world. In and of itself, doubt is bad. It's something we don't want. It is better. It is great. If I have 100% knowledge, zero doubts that 1 + 1 = 2. If I could have 100% knowledge that Christianity was true or that Jesus rose from the dead, that's better. That's the goal. That's the ideal. That's what we as Christians should want. Now, it's just a fact because we live in a fallen, sinful world that for most of us, we don't have 100% knowledge. And that means we do have some degree of doubt, one degree of doubt or another, depending on us as persons and stuff like that. So doubts can be good in an instrumental way. I had doubts, and I think God uses these so long as we are honest about our doubts and we are real seekers. So if you have doubts about the resurrection of Jesus, God acknowledges that. He wants you to be honest. Be honest with him, others, and yourself, and say, well, look, I'm struggling with these doubts about the resurrection. God, give me your help. I am going to, instead of just mindlessly rejecting the resurrection, taking the easy road out, I'm actually going to look into the evidence. I'm going to really seek God's truth here and see, is there good evidence for the resurrection or not? And guess what? I did that. I've been there, and I can guarantee you there is. We have very powerful historical and I alluded to that with like the minimal facts approach. My friend Dr. Gary Habermas, as well Mike Lacona and those guys and stuff like that, they make a compelling historical argument for something like the resurrection. But there are other arguments as well. There's even scientific evidence. I've worked with the experts on the Shroud of Turin, again attesting to the truth of that resurrection miracle. Incredibly powerful. You can check out my Shroud Wars series for that. So there is proof. There is evidential proof on a balance of probabilities. The resurrection's true. If you embrace and deal with your doubts head on and wrestle with God to look over the evidence, it is there and it is sufficient to prove this resurrection event really happened. And this makes Christianity unique among all the other world faiths and other world's religions. Christianity alone is an evidence-based faith. All the other religions are not evidence-based faiths. They have insufficient warrant for their religious beliefs on an evidential basis. Christianity has sufficient evidential warrant for its claims, and that's unique. You can see my friend Dr. Gary Habermas on his website. He's written a book for free called The Uniqueness of Jesus Christ Among the World's Religions. I've included the link there. I'll just quickly show it to you guys. If anyone, so you can see here, it's on Gary Habermas's website right here, garyhabermas.com. If you click on the uniqueness of Jesus Christ, you get this PDF totally for free. And it shows the evidential uniqueness of Christianity versus other religions. So that's it. Look, God wants us to wrestle and grapple with our doubts. But the way we do that is by being a real seeker and looking into the evidence as we truly seek God's truth. So that's it for this show. I've dealt with the 14 objections that a Christian can give here. And let's see, we got a Okay, we got a comment from someone who was here for a bit from A Christian. Amen. Praise Jesus Christ. I totally agree with you. A Christian, amen, and praise Jesus Christ. So, yeah, with that said, that's it for this show. Um, have a great week. And next week, the next show I've got 3 shows next week. So the next one up is with agnostic Kevin Non Tradicath. He's coming on my show to discuss the proof for apostolic succession, as well, disprove because he disbelieves in it, and also discussing his take on various Eucharistic miracles in the Roman Catholic Church and why he's unpersuaded or unconvinced by these supposed miracles tied to Roman Catholic transubstantiation and such. Okay, with that said, have a great week, and I'll see you guys on Monday. The show with Kevin will be on Monday the 8th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. I also have a show on the Shroud of Turin for Shroud Guys on Friday, April 12th. This will be a panel review on the carbon dating with all of the carbon-14 experts, including the atheist Shroud skeptic, Jordan, the nuclear engineer, and Bob Rucker, the nuclear engineer, Dr. Thomas McAvoy, Joe Marino, and Michael Kowalski, the current head and editor of the BSTS newsletter there. Then on April the 13th, on the Saturday, I'm bringing back the psychic Barbara With. I had her on with Tyler Fowler to discuss her kind of beliefs. She believes she's a psychic who's talked with Jesus Christ. She sent me her interview with Jesus, Albert Einstein, Gandhi, all the famous people, right? Obviously, for us as Christians, we disagree. I've read her interview with Jesus, and I've got major problems. I can tell she was not speaking to Jesus at all there. It must have, if she was speaking to anyone, it must have been a demon. So, but she's welcome to, she's asked me behind the scenes some of her problems with Christianity, stuff to do with hell and the conditions for salvation. So, she's been kind enough to agree to come back on the 13th, on Saturday, along with Tyler, to grill a Christian, to debate these doctrines and find out if they're, to basically me and Tyler will be providing a defense for these Christian doctrines that are problematic to her mind, such as hell, or, why do we have to believe in Jesus exclusively versus religious pluralism, all of these kind of things. She's going to be grilling us as Christians. So look out for that, and have a great week, everybody. All right, take care.